Christ writes that a good capsule definition of the spiritual path is that it is a never-ending process of relaxing, of breathing in light, breathing out fear, and of coming into fear's opposite, which is love. And so I would say that Jesus is my spiritual teacher because in meeting him, I recognize something in him. I recognize that he speaks and calls to values in me that are deeper than my Christian faith. Values of compassion and love, so that when I hear Jesus teaching, something burns within me, as I'm sure it does for you as well. Something pre-existing, something innate to being human vibrates with his words, vibrates with the life that he exemplified. So I also recognise that other traditions promote compassion and love, and so it's very easy for me to wander across traditions and to learn from other traditions, because to me, my values, as I said, my values of compassion and love are deeper than my Christian faith. So I recognise that people from outside Christianity are also in pursuit of a path of compassion and love, and I welcome insights from their journeys as well. I also recognise that people from outside the church are not really flocking to progressive churches or even networks. And that saddens me. No matter how thoughtful and accommodating and moderate we are, and even open and genuinely interested in exchange, it's nevertheless a sad truth that not so many people are flocking from outside the churches into our networks. And it's very hard work to be heard, isn't it, over the din of criticism of the Christian church. It's hard work to help people hear our heart-softening and strengthening message over the din of righteous condemnation, righteous criticism of church crimes. Our Christian emphasis on dogma over love, on head over heart, our failure or even our perceived failure to soften and strengthen our own hearts is often thrown in our faces. Margie said she tried to advertise this talk amongst a secular group of activists and was not allowed to because the word Christian, I imagine, was in the title of the group organising this event. So there are many slammed doors, closed ears, which does sadden me because my pathway has always been to follow Jesus, and I see nothing intrinsic to that pathway that need alienate others, that can't be discussed and exchanged and genuinely shared with an open heart. But there is, I think, an incredible spiritual hunger in our community. And of course, as we know, people largely turn to Buddhism to satisfy that hunger. And of course, at its worst, the Western version of Buddhism can be simply an attempt to find peace in the world, in one's private world. But at its best, it is a hunger for genuine experience, for genuinely knowing in one's deepest experience the divine, for an integration of body and heart and mind around values of compassion. So people are after something that is not a list of shoulds, but instead is a genuine pathway. And in Buddhism, meditation is presented as an integral and important part of that pathway. So it was that kind of awareness that led me in 2014 to study to become a certified teacher of something called compassion cultivation training. It was a genuine desire to connect with the impulse in people that is that spiritual hunger and those pre-existing, those underlying human values of compassion and love. My own experience as a trainee doctor and then a young doctor led me to realize that compassion was a somewhat threatened species in the medical profession. In fact, I often felt that my own native intrinsic compassion was not welcome in my training. In fact, it was even a bit uncool. And that was a very traumatizing experience for me, I have to say, because it was as if I was being asked to cut off a part of me in order to become a medical professional. And so that was also part of the motivation for training to become a compassion cultivation teacher. So I went in 2014 to the States to study with a bunch called the Centre for Compassion and Altruism Research and Education, or CCARE, a collection of luminary people, scholars, psychologists, researchers, under the direction of a man called Thupten Jinpa, who is the Dalai Lama's English interpreter. It was a very wonderful experience to train to teach compassion in that environment. And I had, for a number of years after that, was teaching CCT at Melbourne University to medical students and also at times in the general community. The brochure that I've put on your seats is a brochure for an upcoming CCT course that I will be leading starting May the 3rd on Zoom. The other initiative, though, that my desire to connect with people around their compassion led me to is to found a centre called the Centre for a Compassionate Society. It's a centre that grows out of my small church, and its reason for being is to build community around compassion. So to meet people at the level of their deeper values. So a genuinely unbranded, in religious terms, centre in which people can be open to learning from spiritual traditions, but one that talks about a pathway to compassion, offering a pathway to compassion and the propagation of compassion in our world. So let's talk about compassion meditation then. Its purpose is very much softening and strengthening the heart, to promote our ability to find and embody compassion for others and for self. That's something I think sometimes in Christian circles we forget, that compassion can also be extended to oneself. The idea of meditation is that compassion might become our default mode, might become more a part of us, so that when we walk into a room, compassion walks in with us. And it's interesting to reflect on how we sometimes do walk into a room and what we actually walk in with. Whether we walk in perhaps with a sense of wariness. I'm in a room of other people, of course. A sense of wariness, or a sense of competition, or a sense of needing to establish our place. And how freeing it might be just to walk into a room of other people with on the front foot of compassion, with compassion being our first offering. So what is compassion? It's a word, one thing it is a word that is very often misunderstood. People confuse it with empathy, they confuse it with pity, and they see it as something soft, which is why I always say it's about softening and strengthening the heart. A dictionary definition of compassion might be a sensitivity to suffering leading to a desire or commitment to relieve that suffering. This can be present whether suffering is present or not. So giving someone a birthday present can be an act of love or loving kindness, but compassion only makes sense by definition when suffering is present. It's thought of as a capacity, a natural capacity that we all possess, but that's based on some underlying skills, some underlying abilities that we can nurture and cultivate. And the three that are often talked about as being important for the practice of compassion are, first of all, mindfulness, that word that's terribly overused, but could be thought of simply as paying attention to present moment experience with openness and curiosity. So in other words, being in the present, being aware of what is going on within us and having an open attitude to what we notice both within us and around us. Not reacting, not clamping down, not judging or editing our experience. The second of those three skills that are thought to be important for the practice of compassion are loving kindness, which is odd perhaps to think about it as a skill, but perhaps a capacity to generate warmth and unconditional positive regard towards those that we meet, to see in them a potential object of warmth rather than, say, an object of competition or an object at all. So, which leads me to common humanity, which is the third of those skills, that the appreciation of another person in their full humanity, that just like me, this person is just like me in profound and fundamental ways, no matter how different on the surface they appear. So on the surface, Gordon and I have just been away, and this is my husband Gordon over here, I've just been away for our 30th wedding anniversary, and it's not often that I plan presents a long way ahead, but this time I did, and I brought a book by Sebastião Salgado, some photographs of the Amazon as his present. And it's some of whom had been barely contacted by white civilization ever. And one is struck in looking at these people at how different their life experience and their externals are from what we are used to. And yet, some of the expressions on their faces, a kid swinging off a vine and jumping in the river with just glee on their face as they jump, tells me that beneath the exterior, underneath even that person who outwardly looks so different is just like me in important ways. And so the ability to perceive that, to know that, to tap into those commonalities rather than stick with the differences is considered in compassion training to be a skill, to be something we can upregulate, something we can tune up and become more aware of, have more access to. So the Dalai Lama's definition of compassion is that when loving kindness meets suffering and stays loving, that's compassion. And I think that and stays loving is very important, because there can be many reasons why, even if with our good intentions of loving kindness, that our intention can be diverted. So the and stays loving is very important, because compassion is a natural capacity, we have it, but it competes with other capacities within us. Competes with our need to dominate, for example, or our need to be right, perhaps, or our aggression, our natural tendency to flare up in anger when we perceive that we've been slighted or put down in some way. So there are many barriers to the successful practice or mobilization of compassion in any moment. For example, we have a very inbuilt tendency for in-group identification, yeah? We much more naturally demonstrate compassion for people who are just like us in external ways. Other members of a network we're part of, or people who are like us in racial, gender, sexual terms, for people who barrack for the same footy team. We create in-groups and out-groups very naturally and immediately, no doubt for good survival reasons, but nevertheless it can block our expression of compassion across those lines. Our judgmentalism is a barrier to compassion. We create divides between you who are wrong and me who is right, between you who are bad and me who is good. We create these dualisms in our mind, and we think therefore that the person on the wrong side of that dualism is not worthy of our compassion, not deserving of it, and we ration it. We save it for people who we think are deserving of it. We also have a scarcity mentality around compassion, the notion that if we extend our compassion too much, somehow we'll be burned out. We'll be somehow used up. The Buddhists have an understanding of compassion that undercuts that, and that is that it is one of the four immeasurables, that in fact compassion is not a resource that we have to ration. It's a capacity that is self-renewing and rewarding, so that the more we practice it, the more we become compassionate and the more we receive from it. And I think it's also important to say that compassion is a very expansive quality. So I could say that it's softening and strengthening and enlarging the heart, perhaps, because it develops our ability to approach and hold suffering without flinching. Suffering is aversive. No one likes it, even in other people. And sometimes we have a tendency to look away, to shut ourselves off from it, to protect ourselves from it, and that's only natural. But as we practice compassion, it can be more possible to open our heart to accommodate the suffering, not to absorb it necessarily, but to accommodate it and to be with it, and to even be powerless in the face of it sometimes, but just to bring our presence to it. Sometimes there are no solutions to suffering. And so it may simply be that presence is all we can offer, but we can at least infuse that presence with love. So I'm going to shortly lead a compassion meditation. It will be about a 20-minute experience. In fact, the first 10 minutes of that experience, I'm going to lead you in some centering prayer, which is a method I'm sure many of you are familiar with. It comes more from the Christian tradition. Father Thomas Keating, I believe, to be the main initiator of it in our tradition. So there'll be lots of silence in the first 10 minutes. I'll guide you in, and then I'll leave you largely with silence. And then in the second 10 minutes of our 20-minute meditation, I'll be talking a bit more as I lead you through an experience of compassion meditation as it comes largely from the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. So in our first 10 minutes of centering prayer, it will be an opportunity to let go of the incidentals of your life, the daily worries, concerns, plans. For our weekend away, we went to Sherbrooke, and this afternoon, while we were just sort of had a little bit of time to spare, we were sitting in the Alfred Nicholas Gardens, and we decided to sit for a little while in a gazebo there. Lovely spot, beautiful spot, looking out over the Mountain Ash, just gorgeous. And I thought, oh, how beautiful. We can just sit here for a while. We don't have to do anything. And then what happens? The mosquitoes start. And they always go for me more than they do for him. And so I'm sitting there trying to just, be with the bush. And instead I'm swatting mosquitoes off myself, which of course is a little bit like many people's experience of meditation. As soon as we start to quieten, the mosquitoes start. And there is something, isn't there, about that particular drone of a mosquito that is just, it cannot be ignored, especially at nighttime. And so our thoughts, it would seem, pierce into our attention, even when we're trying to put our attention on something. It's a little bit like those mosquitoes that fly around at night time. Unlike a mosquito, though, the analogy will fall down from here. What I'm going to suggest that you do is release those thoughts. Not necessarily even acknowledge them, just find a word with which to release the thought. I use the word release when I meditate. I simply say, when I notice that I'm thinking, I simply say release. Because that word for me also involves relaxation. It involves sort of letting go, of not bracing against the thought, not getting annoyed with it, just letting it go. And the idea, of course, is that as we let go of these daily concerns, we're doing it in the knowledge that one day all those things will fall away. There will just be us in our naked being sitting at the feet of the divine. Have you ever thought about what you were thinking about last month? If you're a meditator, when you were meditating last month and the particular mosquitoes that were flying around in your mind at that time, it's notable, isn't it, how most of them, and yet we seem to think that they're so compelling at the time. There's an opportunity in centering prayer to let go of the mosquitoes and just be. And then in compassion meditation, the second 10 minutes I'll lead you in, remembering that it's an opportunity just to practice the experience of compassion for self and others, so that we can mobilize compassion in more and more challenging situations, so that it becomes our default mode, even when maybe in the past other things might have been triggered, like defensiveness or judgment. And importantly, mobilizing it also for ourselves, which is in the West, a place that we find it perhaps the most difficult to do. So if you struggle with that, please understand that that's very common. You would not be alone in struggling to find compassion for yourself. James Marion, who I quoted before, also writes that the person with Christ consciousness sees all other human beings as the Christ and treats them accordingly. This is the level of true Christian love, which is spiritual love, identical to what the Buddhist masters call compassion. So in this meditation, which will begin very shortly, in that second 10 minutes, I'd invite you to start where it's easy, very much in our in-group, if you like. I'm going to invite you to start to think about a loved one. And I'd like you to choose that loved one now, thinking about someone who is, first of all, alive, but secondly, someone with whom you have a warm and relatively uncomplicated relationship. So not the person you're going to therapy about, but someone who, when you think of them, it's very easy to mobilize those warm feelings. And people often choose a pet because we have our most uncomplicated relationships with our animals, arguably. And we'll begin with your loved one as you silently consider them, and we'll extend out and we'll broaden our network, we'll broaden our capacity to show compassion further and further, becoming global. And we'll encounter some things along the way. If you do encounter some resistance to anything that I'm suggesting that you do, I'd invite you to work compassionately with that resistance. So not to force yourself to go somewhere that you don't wish to go or that's uncomfortable for you to go, but just to see if you can mobilize some compassion around the resistance and perhaps titrate your own experience, be in charge of your own experience, even though I'm the one with the microphone. If my phone is working better than it did before, I will be beginning and ending our experience with a bell. Able to stand up, turn around twice, and sit down again before you start to meditate. And may I ask, just for a show of hands in the room, how many of you have a regular meditation practice of some kind? Yeah, thank you. So this may overlap, may be a little different, I don't know. All right. So as you hear that bell beginning to fade into silence, I invite you to find a comfortable position that is a sustainable position for you for about 20 minutes. Probably with your feet on the floor and probably with your back straight but your belly soft. And if it's comfortable to close your eyes, I'd invite you to do that. And if not, just to drop your gaze to the floor. And I usually like to begin with a few deep, cleansing, diaphragmatic breaths. Allowing the out-breath to be an opportunity for release. For release of unnecessary tension. That was a mistake. A release of unnecessary tension. For a dropping of your shoulders. For a settling into the chair, allowing it to support you. For a softening of your face. And there is a story in the Bible that goes like this. Now, as they were traveling along, Jesus entered a certain village, and a woman named Martha welcomed him into her home. And she had a sister called Mary, who moreover was listening to the Lord's word, seated at his feet. But Martha was distracted with all her preparations, and she came to him and said, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to do all the serving alone? Then tell her to help me. But the Lord answered and said to her, Martha, Martha, you are worried and bothered about so many things, but only a few things are necessary, really only one. For Mary has chosen the good part, which shall not be taken away from her. So let's spend these few minutes together in sitting at the feet of the divine, letting go of the daily, the circumstantial, the ultimately inconsequential details of our lives, and sitting at the feet of Jesus quietly and with intention, so that as thoughts arise, each time you notice that they are arising or have arisen, just practicing using a word, perhaps the word release. You may have your own word, and simply allowing that thought to dissolve back where it came from. as you let your attention rest, perhaps on your breath, or perhaps just on the experience of being quiet. So I'll be silent now for another few minutes. As you take the opportunity to be quiet. And now, as we move into the second part of our meditation, I'd invite you to bring to mind your loved one, that person or animal with whom you have a warm and uncomplicated relationship. And bring them to mind with some detail, getting a sense of their presence. And as you do so, just noticing what feelings of warmth or tenderness might arise. Contemplating the thought that just like you, this person or animal wishes to be happy and yet often suffers. And out of any warmth or tenderness that you feel towards them, offering them some silent wishes, which I will lead you in. And you may like to find your own words, but I'll suggest some. And if it helps to add an endearment at the end, such as darling or sweetheart, you might like to do that. May you be happy. May you flourish. May you be free from pain and hurt and sadness and bitterness. May you know what it is to be truly loved. May you know true happiness. May you know peace and joy. And broadening your attention now, shifting it to the people in this community. If you're here in the room, then those others in the room, but also in our virtual room. And as you broaden your attention in that way, noticing what comes up. Is there the same warmth and tenderness that you felt towards your loved one? Or are there other more complicated feelings that arise? And what would it be like to cultivate each and every person in this community as a loved one? As a potential object of your unconditional positive regard, your future focus, your hope for their well-being. So with whatever willingness you can find within yourself, offering some silent wishes for this community. May we all flourish. May we all know what it is to be deeply loved. May we all be free from suffering and its many faces, from jealousy, from hurt, from rage, from fear, from loss. May we all know true happiness. May we all know peace and joy. And broadening your attention again, how broad shall we go? We could think about the people in this city, in this state, in this nation, but why stop there? Let's go global. Let's think about all the people, indeed all the beings on this teeming, troubled planet. And as you do so, notice what comes up for you. Any sense of resistance or overwhelm? Any sense of wanting to ration your compassion to certain groups who are deserving of it? And what would it be like to just open to the possibility of flinging your compassion left, right, and centre, willy-nilly, to all who have the capacity for suffering? Contemplating the thought that just like you, that person who might be so different from you in externals also wishes to be happy and yet often suffers. Contemplating the thought that that cultural group who embodies values you cannot share in fundamental ways are just like you. Each of them is also a loved one to someone, a parent, child, sibling, or dear friend to someone. And out of that sense of what we share, offering some silent wishes for all beings on this planet. May we all thrive. May we all know true happiness. May we be free from suffering and its causes, from greed, from hatred, from ignorance. May we know love. And since you have gone global with your compassion, contemplating including yourself in your own circle of compassion, as someone who is deserving of your own compassion, no more and no less than anybody else. What would it be like to relate to your own difficulties with concern and care, with tenderness, rather than judgment and criticism? So offering some silent wishes for yourself May I know what it is to be deeply loved. May I be free from suffering and all its faces. May I know peace and joy. So I will remain silent now for a couple of minutes while you continue to work with any aspect of that practice that most speaks to you. So in a moment, when the bell rings, take your own time to bring your attention back to our gathering.
Petrina, we're very much in your debt for the time you've spent with us this afternoon. And I think you will have derived from or divined from the questions and the commentary that you've stimulated a lot of thoughts and questions in people's minds. So we're very grateful and thankful for your being with us, and a small token of our appreciation, which is consumable. I hope you'll find that something which you and Gordon will enjoy it. So thank you very much. Let me talk about the next meeting, the May meeting. First of all, it's going to be another hybrid meeting with physical attendance at the same venue, the Ewing Memorial Centre of Stoniton Community Uniting Church, here on the corner of Burke Road and Coppin Street, East Malvern. And the speaker will be the Reverend Dr. Sally Douglas, whom many of our members will know. She's spoken to us in the past. And she's recently written a book, another book, and it's called The Church Triumphant, which is scribbled out, The Church as Salt, Becoming the Community Jesus Speaks About. And she's in congregational ministry at the Uniting Church in Richmond, but she's also got an academic background. And I think she's one of the most interesting ministers that the Uniting Church has in its cohort in this area. What she's really, without going into what she's going to say to us, the book more or less says, forget about trying to reconstruct the church as it was. That's past and never, it'll never be brought back, and that's a good thing. And there are other ways of becoming church which don't require any particular fascination or about numbers or whatever. It's getting back to really a way of expressing our devotion to the gospel and how to live your lives. It's not on the regular fourth Sunday, which is when we would usually hold our meetings. It's on the 28th, I think it is, the fifth Sunday of May, at 3 o'clock here. I think it will be a very interesting session, so I recommend your attendance very earnestly. The book